Welcome to our study, Desire, Why It Matters. And I'm glad to hear the sound is okay. Thanks. In the first section of Traleg Kyabgon's book, he explores desire and really identifies desire as the principal driving force for our confusion. With our basic setup of the five skandhas and the delusional belief in a self, then we're continually operating with wanting for ourself. And so we very often in religious traditions end up saying, well, this wanting of ours, the self-centered nature of it, makes wanting something we need to get rid of. But that's not the case either, because there is a healthy quality to wanting in the sense of wanting better conditions. And this is then what we're also working with on the Buddhist path to enlightenment. So we want enlightenment, we desire enlightenment. So there's these two, or rather, there's a numerous ways that we can understand the complexity of this issue. Now, in the second part of the book, Traleg Kyabgon then more looks at the mental factors that drive our various impulses and which result in various conditions of happiness and suffering. So we're mapping that. Now, in the last sections, we've looked at particularly what are the negative mental factors. In this section here, we're going to be looking more at the positive mental factors. So positive and negative mental experiences. This work is about our human experience and what we can do to develop. So overall in this book, we're not talking about anything particularly extraordinarily different from what we experience in our everyday life. As we approach Buddhism and as we approach Tibetan Buddhism, we're not going to be fed stories that could that buy into our expectations about what could be. It's very much about relating to what actually happens with us. And so the entire realm of what we're discussing here is something that we can recognize in our immediate experience. So if we look, what is described here corresponds to our experience. Now, very often when we look at the mind, we could sort of make general statements about, well, the mind is like this and the mind is like that, and that could very well help us to understand the mind, but it could also leave us with a rather cerebral and theoretical understanding of the mind. We speak in general terms. Um, we sometimes end up reducing our experience to merely quantifiable objective data, and that's very often what happens in the realms of study of psychology, for example. You get to know a lot about the mind, but you're not necessarily working with yourself or putting yourself into situations where you experience what happens, and so it very much just becomes data. Now, we could also say that, well, I don't need to study this. I can experience my own emotions. And, well, this is what I experience. We feel emotions. But that also is a little bit bypassing the possibility that we could work with emotions. That's simply just saying, well, this is what I feel. So we actually need both these dimensions, the structure that we might get from objective data, quantifiable research, and in general, just mapping the mind, and then also how this applies to ourselves. In the Buddhist journey, we study the mind as per what the teachings tell us, but we're also encouraged to actually make our own experience of this to verify what is being spoken about, thinking critically about what we're hearing, and then aligning it with what we personally experience. So as far as the mind goes, then the various conditions of our mind can be understood in terms of three causes. And the first is the psychological imprints, vasanas, and these are the imprints that lie on our ground consciousness, the um, the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. And when we begin to enact our actions, they become part of us, and this then is part of shaping our person. And this, we could say, lies imprinted on our ground storehouse consciousness. Then there are the objects of the emotions. So in Tibetan we call this, the first one we call Bhakchak, vasanas. This one here we call Nyamon Kiri Yul Nyornepa, which really just means the presence of that which creates or gives rise to the emotions or the conflicting emotions. Um, and that is simply when we perceive things. But the thing is, the way we perceive things is not neutral. We don't just see things, but we actually see things through a particular objective or particular optics. And that's where the way that we experience things, they have also a lot to do with the psychological imprints behind it. Then the third one is not thinking about the whole thing in an appropriate manner. Tsulchen Yilam Macheba means we're not thinking straight. It's like we're just not getting it. What is happening is we're operating with assumptions. We're operating with our particular unique way of perceiving the world. And so we are we are not really seeing things as they are, and we're very convinced that how we see things is how they actually are. So these three causes, they very much influence, or they're basic to how we experience positive and negative emotions. So these actions that we have, they leave imprints, experiences that come up. It can be perceptions, it can be emotions, and so on. And then the way that we engage that with our body, speech, and our mind, that leaves imprints and patterns on our storehouse consciousness. And objects create reactions. And then again, how they are perceived, this depends on our particular um, optics based on the psychological imprints. And then the way that we fixate, the way that we create narratives, stories, then they come from these the two factors above. The already existing imprints, our disposition, and then how we perpetuate or further cultivate these in terms of our reactions. So, psychological imprints, the objects of emotion, and not thinking straight. We'll look at the positive emotions and states of mind. Now, the thing about positive emotions, and this is particularly important if you've been studying the sort of more theoretical aspects of Buddhist philosophy, you might be led to think that, well, positive and negative, it's all the same, it's all delusion. And that's true enough. What is it Chandrakirti says? He'll say that, you know, ordinary beings stupidly engage in negative emotions, smart beings engage in positive emotions, and sages go beyond emotions altogether. So, of course, we might have that kind of theoretical understanding, but the reality is that we are actually much more clear-headed, much more able to make decisions, and much more able to pursue the path of liberation when we have positive emotions. So we see objects, we engage with the world in a much less distorted manner. So not only that, and we could study mm, Buddhism from the point of view of wanting to become happier. We could practice mindfulness from the point of view of being more in balance and be happy and so on. But it has a lot to do also with moral direction. Um, if anybody's interested, there was a very good academic paper written some years ago um, about the poverty of mindfulness when it's divorced of moral direction when it's not understood with ethics. And that sometimes when we have that clinical approach to mindfulness, it lacks that dimension of ethical understanding. So, so, so for us to actually be aware of the world around us and be aware of our own being and what constructs our own being in terms of the happiness of ourselves and others, um, having our particular uh, disposition or psychological condition is essential. So there are 11 positive states of mind. So we look at these. And by the way, when we talk about Abhidharma, we very often say the 51 mental factors. Yeah. So these are then these 11. They are part of these. Yeah. So trust. Um, so that's Deva or Shraddha. So without trust, as skeptics, we cannot develop states of mind beyond ego. The thing about the skeptics or the cynics and so on is that there's this incredible infatuation with not trusting anything or anybody. But that's very much operating from the point of discerning who's who is who is the one that's developing that position. Well, that's our own, you could say, in, strongly ensconced ego. That's very much operating from a habitual point of view, and it doesn't really take us very far. It's highly unimaginative and lacks qualities such as empathy. And there we fail to understand our sacred potential and see beyond a nihilist perspective. The thing is, what we have everywhere in the spiritual traditions is that we're talking about there's something much greater than us just being a motherboard or a piece of, mechanical, being mechanical, or like a, just something entirely functional. We naturally have some intuition about our potential lying far beyond that. And that's not held by ego. So we could talk about that as sacred. And if we are stuck in that cynical or skeptical um, cycle, then very often we see things in terms of only what we actually can assert, and we fail to see or rather, what we can assert with our senses, and that's where we fail to understand the dimension of the our being as such, and particularly then the sacred potential. So this is essentially what the nihilist perspective consists of. When we have trust, that means we trust ourselves, we also have the ability to trust others, then we're naturally able to rejoice and empathize and feel joy in our interaction with others and also in our own existence. So that's trust. Let's see if there's a question here. Could you share the name of that paper? I'll put it up in the reading material. And if I don't, then just send me a mail. And also, yeah, I forget the name of the authors. How would you categorize the difference between trust and faith? Trust is more on a human level, and faith tends to be on a more on a greater level in terms of um, enlightenment, basically. Yeah. Trilinobu Rinpoche in White Sail, he actually makes the distinction between these two. So trust is more on the human level, faith is more on the spiritual level, as far as I can remember. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. It seems to make sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Shame, moza, shi. So appropriate shame is a good thing. We had this discussion in some of these classes. Okay. So when we're talking about shame here, guilt, right? Right now, you're getting the Buddhist version. So we might already have some ideas about these things. That's good. But right now, you're getting the Buddhist angle. So please try to keep an open mind and hear what Traleg is saying. I mean, we already have established familiar, predictable dialogues around this. But the condition of shame, it's actually one of the 7 qualities of the Bodhisattva. It's a good thing, But of course, and Traleg Rinpoche makes this point, knowing our culture, inappropriate shame is not. There's of course times when we're ashamed of things that we needn't be ashamed of, right? But appropriate shame is an okay thing. The thing about shamelessness can be that we could be unfeeling, that we're just inconsiderate, insensitive, hardened, tough, right? So that's not having a sense of shame. That's what we mean here. And shame can make us become a better person, because that's where we also have, it's when we engage in neurotic action and we actually overlook or miss. So it's not about defining ourselves in a particular negative way. It's rather defining ourselves in a positive way, because when we feel shame, it's because we feel this is not necessarily innate to us. And so basically, shame is something that can prevent us from acting in an insensitive way that's doesn't take into account the causes and effects. Yeah. Okay. So faith or conviction is also a translation of Shraddha. Okay, great. Then somebody's saying how to balance trust and gullibility. Well, when we actually apply prajna, and here again, there is a certain degree of you could say skepticism that is encouraged in Buddhism. We do want to be discerning, smart. We want to inquire. Thing is, once we inquire and we begin to see something, then we gain trust. And that's the very opposite of gullibility. So we should establish our trust on the basis of inquiry. And that's, of course, also what the Buddha famously said. We shouldn't accept his teaching on the basis of trust in his person, but on the basis of our own inquiry. So, for example, if you don't, let's say that, I always think of this example with, you think there's a thief hiding in the next room, right? So somebody might say, well, there's no thief there. But if you go and you say, I'm not sure, and you actually don't trust somebody saying there's nobody there. You go, you switch on the light, you look around, there's nobody there. That's where trust is established. You might trust the person who initially told you, and you also feel certainty. Whereas if you just say, oh yeah, okay, I choose to just trust you, that is being gullible. So trust is actually based on inquiry, and gullibility is not. Okay, so is there a question here? I would argue, well, this is where I think it's helpful if we listen to what Traleg Rinpoche says, yeah? Anyway, okay, here we go. I would argue that shame is not synonymous with guilt. Shame can move us forward on the path, whereas guilt has a sense of holding us back and includes attachment to the action, and so we often repeat the action, repeating the cycle. Indeed, yes, yeah. So true, yeah. So shame is not about something that we're stuck with in a negative way. It is indeed, you're right. It is what pushes us forward. Okay. Hi, I want to know, does shame strengthen our ego self? Uh, no, the point here is that it doesn't, because it's shame that actually identifies and makes us feel uncomfortable with the patterns of ego. Let's say ego drives us um, to take something, a crime of greed, and that's where we afterwards said, what did I just do? I, you know, I took something that wasn't given to me. So that's where shame takes us beyond the ego. We might also, for example, want to retaliate with aggression. That's ego wanting it, but then we feel, no, I don't want to be that person. We'll look at the two angles on that. So shame does take us beyond ego. I think of negative shame, which is more connected to ego. Yes, exactly. So that's where, um, so when we fixate, we're sort of regurgitating and so forth in a negative way, then it, it it can strengthen our ego. Inappropriate shame is what Traleg refers to. Shame can open the way to empathy. Rinpoche really touches on how this establishes our humanness to understand others. Indeed, yes, yes. So, yes, shame is a good thing. I'm glad we seem to all agree on that. That's great. Yeah. Now we're going to look at the next thing, which actually, so shame is very much about us looking at ourselves, right? Now there's another thing, which is the quorum. Traleg Apatrapia. Okay, so this has more us to do with um, so where the previous one, shame, is more about how can, like Charlie Goodman say, I can't, I don't feel good about myself being in this one. The quorum is more actually about how we are integrating with others and how we uh, identify our integrity in the context of others, and that's important. We might claim that, oh yeah, I'm not driven by what others might think of me, but to a large extent we are, and we'd be very insensitive if we weren't. So we're conscious about how others perceive our actions, and also we care about our societal context, our family, friends, and others. There's very often where we we better have decorum when we find ourselves as part of communities, families, etc. So the quorum, good to have also. Not being overly possessive. Now that basically means no desire, desirelessness, aloba. Now there's a couple of implications here. So the first is to be equanimous. Am I pronouncing that right? Equanimous? Equanimous. Okay, equanimous. Okay, anyway, you know what I mean. So that's where we we can disassociate from a particular agenda, a particular ambition, and so on. We engage, and then if things work out, that's fine, and if it's not, that's also okay. This also comes with the ability to not be caught up by our blinded by our desires, and rather than to have a little bit of a what do you call it, recul, a little bit of a distance to things, where we actually assess things and we see clearly, and that enables us then to do what we want to do, to align our theory with our practice. I always like to quote Trinley Noble Rinpoche, who said to a friend of mine, "Do what you want to do, and don't do what you don't want to do," which I always thought was amazingly profound. And if you sort of analyze it, you probably think that's incredibly simple and only too obvious. But then again, if when you live life, then you find out that that's actually very good advice. Do what you want to do and don't do what you don't want to do. And then there's non-hatred. Absence of hatred, shidang meba advesa. So absence of hatred is that we don't wish others pain, that we're not malicious. This means that we're not driven by a deep sense of wishing others pain. Yeah, the opposite of that, and that's where we don't see the others innately as apart from ourselves. See, if we are entirely self-centered, then we actually don't care about others. They're only, you know, um, means to an end. But here, with that absence of anger, non-hatred, then there's actually not this barrier and this alienated relationship with others, and we wish to connect with others. Wishing to connect with others, oh yeah, wishing and then actually connecting with them. So that's the implication of that. And if we were to not have that, then we would end up feeling lost or alienated and essentially untrusting, not not sensing that the others and ourselves share a common cause. Non-deludedness, timuk meba, amoha, and this possibly, well, Traleg certainly says it's the most important one, because that's actually understanding the dependent nature, the constructed nature of phenomena. So, for example, when we have a particular emotion, then we'd want to understand our particular impulse. We understand that there are many different uh, conditions that drive that. And that's a tremendously powerful insight, because that enables us to dismantle impulses and emotions, not as a unitary, not as a battle against a unitary force, but rather being able to dismantle them from various angles. So if we think I am angry, and I have this single emotion, is actually a flawed thought. It's not that I am angry. It's that there's an anger taking place. There's a disposition that we have from before, the three that we started off talking about. There's a disposition that we have that make us see things in a particular way. But it's on the basis of these particular causes, these two causes, that actually this is taking place. And we can analyze. We can analyze, first of all, the subject. We can analyze the object. We can see what it is that possibly triggers, and we can understand the complexity of that. We can also see if we begin to see the complexity of the other, etc. So we want to understand that emotions are due to many physical, mental, situational, and interpersonal factors. This is what Traleg says. We want to understand all of these. Then there's being spirited. This is tsundra virya, which Traleg sometimes also translate as vigor. In classical Buddhist texts, we translate this as diligence, and I think Tumpa sometimes translates it as energy. But it's not just, you know, being diligent in the sense of due diligence, but rather there's a joy factor. There's an enthusiasm, there's a momentum that's taking place. And so being spirited comes with this wish to elevate oneself and to do something about things and not be pathetic or lethargic or complacent. Thing is, when we're sluggish, then we're very easily seduced by negative narratives, negative impulses, negative emotions and feelings. So being spirited is to be energetic, being energetical, vigorous, inspired. So that's number 7. See here. How does do what you want to do, etc., relate to not being possessive? Because actually, what's being proposed here is basically saying be intelligent. It strikes a nerve in terms of being clear on what do you really want to achieve. And the thing is, often when we just go blindly with our wants, we're actually not doing what we want to do. We're actually doing what we don't want to do. You know, I mean, anybody who's trying to stop a bad habit, picking out on chocolate or smoking or whatever it might be, then yeah, you want to do it, but you don't really want to do it. So that's where there's what Trinley Novarim was talking about. There was introducing essentially prajna, wisdom, in terms of our decision making. Conscientious awareness, bhaya apramada, and this means to actually be aware in the sense of how we conduct ourselves. When we talk about ourselves in Buddhism, we refer to the dimensions of body, speech, and mind. So it's about being intelligent and sensitive with how we act in terms of ourselves and also others. And so it is again looking at um, yeah, it's not about just seeing what we're doing, but actually being proactive. So this conscientious awareness, which very often is, by the way, translated as, it's very often translated as, very often translated as carefulness. Yeah, yeah, carefulness. Carefulness. Chapter 4 in the Way of the Bodhisattva. Um, and what this involves is not just being sort of careful in the sense of pussyfooting around, but it means more that we are we're discerning in how we do things, and it's also being proactive. So this brings about positive mental states. It's about avoiding us slipping into carelessness that brings negative states. And this again also is very much about our commitment in terms of ethical training or ethical practice. So the way that we act beyond the ordinary narrowness of our habitual and self-centered impulses. Processing of body and mind, Xinjiang Prashrabi, and Trungpa actually uses the word Xinjiang, just imports it as a useful word. It means proficiency or working with the body and mind. And so it's very often also seen as the outcome of shamatha practice. So when we're not Xinjianged, when we're not processed, when our body and mind are out of control, then yeah, we might do what we want, but we also, as a consequence, also we feel low, we feel down, we feel heavy. Whereas with Xinjiang, body and mind, we're light and workable. Actually, in the shamatha charts that you sometimes find in Tibetan tankas, when you see actually the practitioner sort of fly into the sky or ride an elephant or just generally be very light and mobile, and it implies then this pliable or workable quality of the mind. So this is an important part of developing positive emotions. So then equanimity, Tangyum Upeksha, and equanimity enables more effective engagement. Now this is an important point because very often we think, well, equanimity would just be sort of everything would just be blah and very, if everything is just fine, that means we're not really touching on the textures of phenomena, and we're not really appreciating the variety of um, our world. And this is actually not it. Equanimity means that we're not continually battling with how things are, and we actually enable us to be more involved with the world. We sense the world more, and we're also more willing to engage with the world. So that's where equanimity is basically dismantling this apparatus of censorship or filtering. So that's what we mean with equanimity, that we're more open, accepting. And that also means that we're not too excitable. And that again doesn't mean that we're sort of all the time sort of living on we're sort of flatliners in some way. But it more just means that we have the freedom in various circumstances. We're we're not continually reacting. The thing is, once we're reacting, we're very much caught up in some self-absorbed cycles where we're quite insensitive to what's happening around us. Whereas the moment that we are not too excitable, it enables us to be more aware of what is taking place, and that means we also not so controlled. There's not so many. We don't perceive so many blind spots. We're not held back by blind spots that we don't know about. So we're less controlled. So with equanimity also then positive emotions arise more easily, since that we're less self-absorbed, less caught up in ourselves, less sort of driven by negative impulses. And then finally, non-violence, nampa mitsewa, ahimsa, is to at all times not be violent is not the same as not getting angry. So it doesn't mean that if we're a non-violent person, we might not get angry. Um, Anger can be very, of course, a natural human reaction to negative circumstances, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're violent persons. So that's not the same. And non-violence is that we don't see others. Um, yeah, it's to view others without hostility. So there's not an ingrained attitude again about others. Sometimes we would say that entire Buddhist teaching can be summed up in terms of non-violence, in that it's this openness and sensitivity to reality really that enables us to awaken. Can you see some parallels with these and the eight of the Noble Eightfold Path? What's that right view? Yeah, definitely. Mhm. Yeah, all of this really, these the entire Abhidharma is very much about us gaining what is called right view. So I think the what we call wisdom, prajna, is consists of right contemplation and right view. So yeah, these are part of that, but it also influences the other eight, also in terms of both conduct and also concentration. Being proactive in taking direction, meaning taking action rather than being following direction of another. Yes, yeah, and also rather than just going along with our own habitual patterns. Yeah? Um, Violence can be expressed without being specifically angry, wouldn't you say? Like, it's more an attitude, I think. Well, you're probably thinking of, let's for example take the example of Jesus in the temple who threw out the money makers, right? Or what's called the money lenders. And so, yes, we could say that's wrathful action, we would say, without being angry. Mm, yeah, I don't know if we would call that violence particularly. We have a little bit of vocabulary in Buddhism where we probably would use the word wrathful, wrathful action. But yeah, anyway, proactive actions that's devoid of anger can very well be, you could say, assertive to a certain, to some extent. Yeah. So this is do what you really want to do rather than what you want to do. Yes, you can ask yourself, do you really want to do it? That's right. Okay. So emotions and states of mind. So emotions, positive and negative, depend on positive and negative states of mind. So for us to have particular emotions very much depends on our states of mind. So for example, if we're moody and sort of, there's sort of a undertow of negative state of mind, then it's more easy to begin to have negative action, negative emotions. And similarly, also, if we have sort of a joyful disposition, then it's easy to also feel um, feel feel joyful emotions. I'm going to turn off the webcam. As you know, my internet here is not ideal, so I hope this helps. Right. So and then now, as far as okay, so we first have the emotions that depend on the negative states of mind, and then the states of mind again depend on our habituated beliefs, attitudes, opinions. So we might have particular uh, attitudes that drive these kind of states of mind. So we might have some pre-existing attitudes about situations, people, politics, etc., etc. So in terms of all of these aspects, they are what we need to be aware of, and they need to be dealt with in order to overcome negative emotions and develop positive emotions. So what we looked at here in terms of attitudes, opinions, habituated beliefs, this is where we look at dependent arising. And the more that we have the understanding of dependent arising, then also we have less fixation. And when we have less fixation, then we have more light states of mind, and also from that then we also have lighter emotions. But all of that, again, comes back to us being proactive. It is about us changing our beliefs, attitudes, and behavior. So it's about us essentially changing ourselves. Traleg says, we cannot simply give rise to positive emotions if we do not take all the influencing factors into account. If we work with ourselves comprehensively and in accordance with these 11 virtuous mental states, as they are often called, then the positive emotions will arise and negative emotions will diminish. Without that, we could try to love every sentient being, but still be a horrible partner at home, for example. It is about attitudes and beliefs. So it's about engaging ourselves on every level. So is having less fixation help to change attitudes? Attitudes are more underlying in my mind. Um, yeah. Now, Charlie Rinpoche actually, interestingly, he talks about how a lot of fixation is conceptual, and so attitudes, yes, you could say they're right. They are very basic. It's on the basis then of these attitudes that we then fixate. But it goes together. And what Traleg is suggesting and what the Buddha is suggesting is for us to begin to change our basic beliefs. And that's where the study and understanding of dependent arising, meaning emptiness, meaning the the lack of inherent existence in phenomena, and understanding phenomena as really just existing in terms of conditions. When we begin to understand that, then we don't see phenomena as having absolutes. We begin to see them as a chain of causes and conditions. And when we begin to have that, that influences our attitude. And then as an expression of that, also we begin to fixate less. We begin to have less tendency to retreat into solid attitudes and positions. Okay. Yeah. So um, fixation and attitudes go very much hand in hand. Okay. So Charlie Grimage says, in Buddhism, it's very important to understand what we are all about. We cannot be reductionist about the human condition. As Buddhism keeps saying, we have to walk the middle way. Managing our emotions along with our beliefs, attitudes, and so on has everything to do with the middle way. Rather than us first going to one extreme and then the other, the poles of eternalism and nihilism. Nor are we to demonize negative emotions as anathema and elevate positive emotions as supreme. The Buddhist view is to work with both of them so that gradually we become transformed. It's about transformation, working with what we do have and working towards what we do not have. To get what we want, we have to work with what we have. So that's something that we probably recognize the value of. If we're gonna change, we have to accept ourselves as we are sometimes here, and that basically means working with where we are with what we have. But we can't we can't just we can't be continually just um, having a theoretical, mechanistic view on the human condition. It's so much about us really working with who we are and what we're experiencing. And so that's what we mean then with the middle way, that we're working with, on one hand, that there's a possibility that we can change, but at the other hand, that change doesn't imply that there's a good and evil that's at work in us. It's just causes and conditions that are working within us. And so this is where we're working. This is where we're working with our existing conditions, but also with a vision of what we potentially could be. Yeah. Okay. Next chapter: Buddhism, psychology, and psychotherapy. Um, It's very much about taking into consideration the context of um, obviously our society, our culture, and where our ambition to progress towards enlightenment, where that fits in. This is very much based on Traleg Kyabgon's experience then with living in um, within our particular cultural context of modernity. Now, as far as enlightenment goes, and the Buddhist approach is that we can't bypass our psychological issues. So, as much as we might be onto the idea of enlightenment and having a spiritual identity, being spiritual persons, and so on, there's still a bit of laundry that remains, and we can't really just ignore that. Actually, there's a lot of discussion in contemporary Buddhist circles about um, spiritual or psychological bypass. And that's obvious that when we're working on the path, we we can't do that. There's a certain danger, and of course, this is partly also because we have something that's in a cultural transition. A lot of the teachings that we receive sometimes are phrased in foreign languages that might appear exotic and which sort of might take us into a romantic dimension where we think maybe we can just wish our old identities and our old issues, we can wish them away. That obviously won't work. Traleg Rinpoche, what he's talking about here is based on his study and dialogue. And he also makes a disclaimer that he's not an expert, authority on psychotherapy and psychology. Um, but he's been very interested. And of course, what we benefit from in Traleg Rinpoche's teachings is that he does have a large exposure to the language of psychology as we're familiar with it in our culture. This enables him also to reach us in a wonderful way. And so Rinpoche has this background, um, but he also wants to stress that certainly Buddhism in itself also has the necessary resources, not only for enlightenment, but also for approaching ordinary life and our experience of life, establishing the foundations for happiness within our everyday life. But there's definitely the conditions are there for misunderstandings to take place, and that is where then sometimes people will, and of course, drawing on this sort of what I would say things slipping between the cracks in the context of cultural importation, then there are persons who of course identify how Buddhism doesn't seem quite to be working, and that's fair enough. It's not that Buddhism is not working, but of course it's more about assimilation and application of Buddhism that's the problem. So that's where Traleg Rinpoche then speaks about what needs to take place for Buddhism to work. And that's why he says wholehearted study and practice with the guidance of a qualified teacher will, if we have that, these conditions are there, wholehearted study and practice and the guidance of a qualified teacher, that will cover all bases. So when we practice the path, when we practice Buddhism, when we're studying it, practicing it, and so on, this enables us not just to engage in some exotic dimension of enlightenment, but it also really prepares us for the very immediate experiences of our ordinary life. Definitely, it is the Buddhist path is about ultimately leading to liberation, but we also do talk about the temporary value of happiness. So for this to work, a wholehearted application is essential. Obviously, half-hearted approach won't take us far. And this is where we're very much, there's nobody really that can judge this except ourselves. We have to be quite honest with how actually we are practicing. We might look as if we practice wonderfully. The beautiful thing about many of our lineage teachers is they're the first ones who would, they'll be, um, they, I wouldn't criticize our lineage teachers as such, but I would say they provide great role models I feel always very inspired from Songse Khyentse Rinpoche, but also you have this in Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche or Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, Tugopen Wangil and others. This that they actually take into their mouth, stating their inferior practice. Sometimes I make a poor show of imitating them, but and but really I really appreciate that, because that actually is something that we might know, it might go under the radar, that we are practicing, we might think we're practicing perfectly, but actually there are places where it slips. And so that's where we should be very aware of whether or not, before we become critical of the Dharma, we should be very aware of, are we actually practicing it? So, so that's where it's um, it's very inspiring to sort of see how sometimes lineage masters even would say, like Paltru Rinpoche, he would refer to himself as a Dharma fraud. And the Dingo Chen's Rinpoche, one place he refers to himself as a useless old maniwa, someone who just sits around and recites the Mani mantra, etc., etc. Anyway, so as far as our wholehearted application then goes, we need to follow through with whatever discipline we undertake. So whatever we're practicing, we need to really practice it on the basis or on the premise of that particular discipline. Now, when we come across aspects of the path, then we should give it the benefit of the doubt. We shouldn't necessarily say, well, that's useless, and then I want something else. Of course, it might not be appropriate for us, but not understanding it doesn't really mean that it's not good for us. It just means that we don't understand it. So that's where sometimes there are teachings that we might not understand, then actually we should try to understand them. So we want to get to the bottom of all the aspects of the path. This is also interesting that whenever we study various teachings, and there are countless teachings, right? If we understand them, where they're coming from, usually we'll be amazed how incredibly skillful they are. And this is not just about the path, but also this enables us to gain insight into the human condition, into the general world that we live in. Traleg says, so our approach to theory and practice needs to be thorough, and our criticism can be arrested for a time, curbing our tendency to discount the value of something too quickly before investigating it properly. This gives us time to develop a more thorough understanding. Then one is in a much better position to make an informed decision and debate the validity of many of the theoretical points. So there's a lot of value in thinking critically, um, because that actually is the doorway to having a more thorough understanding. So that's where thinking critically doesn't mean that we dismiss things, but it actually means that we begin to we investigate the teaching. The thing is also, you gain trust in the teaching the more you begin to realize the profundity of the teaching. Then when you come across something you don't understand, you just sort of think, well, this has something to do with my lack of understanding rather than a flaw in the teaching. Now, for the modern person who has been brought up to what Traleg refers to, sort of subscribing basically to the notion, and the very insightful notion of relativity and relativism, means that there's nothing that has absolute value. That's fair enough. But at the same time, on a practical level, then conditions like faith and conviction, which is very absent in the modern person's vocabulary and praxis, if you like, um, they're really essential for what we're doing here. So the good news is that these concepts, faith, conviction, so on, they can be understood without necessarily standing in opposition to things. We're not proposing fundamentalism or a narrow view. Rather, faith, because it's about beginning to trust the nature of the world, trust our insight and our ability to deal with the world, then it enables a much greater and broader worldview. It's basic to our not just understanding intellectually, but also our experience of vipassana. Traleg says, in many ways, the modern person has been inculcated with relativist ideas. And if we really want to follow Buddhist teaching and gain great benefit, it requires not only commitment, but also a degree of conviction of faith. Conviction in a reliable teacher and conviction born from experience and study. This is essential, but not in a dogmatic or fundamentalist sense. We can commit ourselves to something without the need for discounting the value of other things. So we can see that something works, and just because it's working for us, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we need to dismiss other things. So we need to be clear. It's preferable to be clear and focused about life, not letting it happen haphazardly. And very often, and this also we have a lot in latter modernity, is this sense that where we can't really understand reality, it's too confusing. But then again, we just adopt sort of a ironic attitude. We just sort of laugh at everything and just let things slip by without any attempt even to really understand things. We we just let the world happen, and that's where it's important that we actually have some sense that we could take something seriously. There are really valid contenders in terms of uh, providing a valid worldview. Um, and that's, of course, where we're looking at Buddhism, and also we do that with psychology, with psychotherapy, with philosophy, and so on. But the thing is also, when we assess these, and that's both from the Buddhist side and also from the non-Buddhist or the traditions of psychology, philosophy, and so on, we need to be free of prejudice. And it doesn't help if we're just sort of taking little things and say, oh yeah, they do that, and I don't like that. That's not going to really help us, because when we do that, then there's other aspects that we fail, that we miss. And so regardless of whether we're coming from the Buddhist camp or the non-Buddhist camp, to have this attitude of just sort of picking out little pieces that we don't agree with, and on the basis of that, chucking out the whole project is really quite um, sad, and it's also very uninformed. And we could end up discarding what has great value. We can find um, a lot of valuable things in Buddhism and in psychotherapy. So, in terms of us then practicing Buddhism, um, it's important that we don't just fixate on, well, I'm not like this and I'm not like that. We might have had some ideas that if we start practicing meditation within a number of years, we'd be almost enlightened or halfway there or something, or extraordinarily one thing or the other. And it's quite important that we don't fixate on just what we haven't achieved. The interesting thing also, Charlie Grimage doesn't say that, but I'm just thinking, very often what really actually where we are benefiting or where we are progressing are actually places where we don't notice it. And so we might actually um, be increasingly more humble, increasingly more sensitive to others, etc. And there's a lot of good qualities that we might not notice. So as far as the practices go, you might sometimes we come across practices that, yeah, they have a cultural component, um, but they are generally they're more than just cultural, and there's a lot of skill in them. So there's most of the Buddhist practices we can very well practice without uh, necessarily um, just without needing to translate them as such, in the sense that we don't really need to change them, but we do need to have a foundation of knowledge to understand what's the purpose. Once we understand the purpose, then it it has a lot of relevance. For example, when you do sadhana practice, Vajrayana sadhana practice, you'll have a section where initially where you give a what we call toma to the local landowners. Try and think of that. You might think, oh, that's a really Tibetan superstitious thing to do, to give a cake to, spirits that you can't see. That's not it. And interestingly, in Australia now, there's a lot of we acknowledge the original owners of the land and their elders, past, present, and emerging, all of that. Well, that's actually that humble recognition that we're just guests. It's a very good place to come to. And also in terms of just recognizing our context and the way that we're indebted to a number of circumstances that allow us to be where we are. So where we could trip ourselves up by assuming that some of the practices are cultural. Actually, once we begin to understand them, then we actually realize that they're not particularly culturally bound, or not ultimately culturally bound at all. So it's through then this pursuit of knowledge, through the study of philosophy and psychology, then that we don't lose the breadth of the path, that we begin to understand really the enormous brilliance and value of the path. So that's about the path, but also, of course, what we're doing is looking at the path in terms of what transforms us. So this is what the ultimate purpose is. But to that end, understanding the nature of the path is really important. Traleg says, without us developing understanding of this major aspect of the tradition, here Traleg is referring to the psychology of the Abhidharma, and further not properly addressing the breadth of Buddhist study and practice, this risks such profound teachings being lost, diluted, or even dismembered through not being properly integrated. Further, it reduces the transformative capacity this tradition can have on our lives. Is faith conviction also having conviction in yourself and the practices you engage in? Yes, very much. Faith ultimately takes us beyond duality. So trust in the teacher, trust in the three jewels and so on is actually what enables us to gain non-dual um, faith, non-dual conviction. So ultimately, the outer object, that is you could say, object of faith, is actually what becomes the agent that enables us to gain faith in ourselves, confidence in ourselves. Yeah. Individualism and relationship. So in the Western modern world, individualism is basic to our personal relationships. We very much see our relationships in terms of what's in it for me. Um, and in general, the whole individualist pursuit is very much basic to the ethos and the worldview of the modern person, right? Realizing ourselves and all of that. In Buddhism, the emotions then that arise in our personal relationships are seen in terms of the naked experience itself. For example, jealousy. Now, this is where very often in our relationships we'll then see, well, I feel like this with that person, and hence, in terms of it, it's not about my commitment to the other, but more about how do I feel. Then I want to extract myself from that relationship because this person makes me feel jealous, or this and that takes place in the dynamic. And that's where we would say, well, we analyze and then we see, yeah, that came from that person or this circumstance and so on. Actually, what we mean here with what we're doing in Buddhism is that this experience arises, and yes, it's uncomfortable and so on, but we're more interested in looking at the experience itself because that might arise in other contexts as well. So we can't just say, well, that came from this person or that circumstance. Rather, it's something that happens to us. We have the vasanas, we have the psychological imprints. We do indeed have an object, but that object is also constructed on the basis of our particular psychological imprints. So much better that we actually go right to the root of things and we begin to look at dealing with the the experience, the discomfort, such as jealousy. So we remedy it. We don't ask where does it come from in terms of pointing fingers, but rather we deal with this thing that arises. We're prone to it clearly. We have the disposition for it. We deal with it. So that's where in Abhidharma we cultivate our positive side, which is then essential to interpersonal relationships. Because once we're able to remedy and deal with and understand, this is not just about us remedying, as in saying you should go away, but it's understand the conditions of it, then that enables us much more to engage in um, positive emotions. And this again is then what will influence the interpersonal relationships. And we'll also see that we're very often um, blame other persons once we've dealt with actually our own experience, then strangely enough, the relationship also improves. It's as if the other person or the other circumstances might change. So this this is about us extracting ourselves from what Traleg Rinpoche, right from the beginning of this book, really identified in terms of how desire can diminish us and the negative emotions can diminish us. Once we're free of what diminishes us and fixating less on our problems, we begin to have a much broader worldview. We have we're much more robust. Okay. Um, yeah, I'm going to leave the webcam off. Um, yeah. So Charlie Grimmer says we want to loosen the grip of our minds. Sorry, we want to loosen the grip our minds can develop on aspects of ourselves we and others find problematic. In that sense, rather than delving deeply to discover where a particular neurosis may have originated and becoming fixated on that as the cause of our misery, we look at disturbances that can be more easily detected and then transform those. In that sense, we're not digging down deeply, but rather responding to what arises in our mind. It is about developing a more inclusive and broader view rather than a myopic view of ourselves or a given situation. This is quite important, I think, considering how we, in the in our modern cultural discourse, we very often fail to, um, you know, some aspects of our psychological traditions, or certainly in our some of aspects of our discourse around what happens in our mind, the sort of experience, the human experience, we actually fail to look at how our neurotic disposition can be transformed, and we more talk about the circumstances. Renunciation and non-attachment are easily misunderstood, even among Buddhists. So what we mean with renunciation and non-attachment is the determination to be free. It's about us changing our priorities. It's about us beginning to be clear on what it is we need to do. And that's where we really develop a sense of direction. And that's what we mean with renunciation and non-attachment. So it's not about rejecting a conventional life per se, but about priorities and how to spend one's time. So we could very well be laypersons and still dedicate our time and our energy and our attention to the pursuit of the practice of enlightenment. If we already have families, children, and so on, commitments and what have you, then wanting to be up in a retreat or a cave or something is not going to be particularly helpful. And even if we were in these places, if we didn't have that determination, then these circumstances might not even help. So really renunciation is something that has much more to do with our attitude than the actual external circumstances. Monastics and lay practitioners alike work need to work with the tendency to grasp and fixate, in the sense that yes, monastics, they make choices to have the ideal conditions for practice. Lay practitioners also are in some ways also practicing, and very often are actually providing the foundations for others around them. So very often the bodhisattvas are, for example, seen as lay persons. You know, Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Samantabhadra, and all of these, the bodhisattvas are portrayed not as renunciants, but as lay persons. And so it's very often the lay practitioners are there looking after others. But regardless of the two approaches that are equally valid, what's essential is to then work with the mind that that that's that deludes itself through grasping and fixation. So freeing ourselves from myopic fixation, we relate more completely with the world. So what we do when we fixate is we get stuck. And what we're proposing with the path is to open up. So in doing so, we reduce suffering, we relate more to our life, we live more, and we are more honestly relating to ourselves and others. So this objective, of course, what we're doing here with the path is also reflecting in Traleg Kyabgon here describes the reason why, for example, we would do retreat. Now, retreat doesn't mean sort of a lifelong determination to have nothing to do with the rest of the world, but it's just something that we might do sometimes, really, in order to align ourselves. So Traleg Kyabgon says the purpose of retreat is not to learn to detach ourselves from others and the world. Rather, the aim of retreat is to reduce distractions and devote time increasing our understanding of the human condition. We can then use that insight effectively to work on our habitually held beliefs and perspectives in order to see the world more as it really is, rather than how we have personally constructed it to be. So that's why we do a retreat. And it's really about us working with our habitually held beliefs. And again, it's about seeing the world for what it really is. And people will say, well, how can we really know the world as it really is? Well, if we begin to take into account that we construct the world and see how we construct the world, the degree to which we can dismantle that, yes, then we are beginning to see the world and reality as it is. Somehow, I am hearing the advice is to deal with what is more easily dealt with rather than using energy to understand uh, underlying causes. Though I wonder why it would not be actually helpful to understanding our habitual choices at the heart of causes we trigger with our actions. Yeah, that is true. And of course, it is helpful to understand the circumstances, but particularly from the Buddhist point of view, these circumstances, they, in a way that they are circumstances, helps us to understand that there's not really an inherently existing object out there. And there's also not an inherently existing subject that experiences that. So the moment that we begin to understand our own conditions and the conditions of the circumstances, we're beginning to actually pave the way for understanding dependent arising. But of course, in terms of that's more on the level of attitudes. But what we're doing here with the Abhidharma, and which is more along the lines of the psychology of meditation, is feeling the jealousy, feeling the anger, and saying, this is it. It's not like, the anger came about due to this and that. And yeah, that's right. We can, but what would be significant in that is more to understand that it's constructed. And also, as we looked at before, that we looked at before. One is that we're not actually seeing the reality that clearly, because the reality that we're seeing is very much filtered due to our previous psychological imprints. Yeah. Okay. So, seeing through the deception of our grasping, we're more open to the world. that's really the point, that we are sort of humbly aware of how we limit the world, and if we, as we're practicing the path and letting go of grasping, then we're connecting more with the world. So we see the interconnected nature of our reality and develop more compassion for others. So the first one is more about the prajna, the wisdom, and the second one is more about the compassion. Now, so this is all about still along the lines of detachment, right? But you would then say, oh yeah, and there's a strong culture of detachment in in Buddhism. Well, interestingly, actually, in Asian cultures, there's a very strong culture of attachment. There are very strong family ties. There's a very strong sense of decorum in terms of the the um, the larger community and so forth. So there's some very strong sense of relationship. Yeah. So there it's interesting to see that the practice of non-attachment is actually not really seen in opposition to that. So in our culture, then in modern culture, there's very much, with the nuclear, what they call, yeah, the nuclear family and so on. Whereas in Asian cultures, there's very much a strong emphasis on relationship and the fabric of communities. But the thing is, the practice of non-attachment is not really seen as something that's about extracting ourselves from that. And the curious thing is, it's seen to as something that benefits society. You know, you the the point of non-attachment is not about sort of cutting off from other people. It's more about not being too tied down and just being able to have space and time to the path. It doesn't really mean that we're that we alienated or extracting ourselves, ostracizing ourselves from society. So relationships are very important. Traleg, he says Tibetans, for example, value relationships above everything else, and that includes their relationships to their own teacher. It is actually not beneficial if relationships are not considered as valuable. It is all too common to see people throw away a good friendship because there has been a misunderstanding, and to break up a marriage because it became a little uncomfortable. Of course, I'm not saying that every form of relationship is good, but it's not a good thing to free yourself from a real and genuine bond. So this situation with relationships is also key to the notions of spiritual connection, and sometimes it's almost as if that is almost the most important. Um, Sometimes within sanghas, um, it's not so much about being a good or bad person, but it's more about just being willing to hang in there. And similarly, also with our relationship with others, there's a we know from ourselves that very often some of the strongest relationships we have are actually not necessarily ones that have been particularly rosy or easy. Um, so there's a lot of value in this quality of relationship, also because it ultimately really is founded on a basic sense of trust, a sort of vision of basic goodness. So enlightenment is not ending on all relationships. On the contrary, so on the path, with our practice of not fixating and not grasping, not attaching ourselves, it's more about us extracting ourselves from a self-absorbed world of projections that we are held within this perception of a solid world that in fact is put together very much by our um, particular optics, as we've already talked about. And so this is where we begin to open up to our connection with others. So it is discovering reality as it is with its intimate relationship with ourselves and others. So that's where the degree to which we dismantle our barriers between self and other, our duality, the more we open ourselves up to others. So when we are engaging in the path, it's about understanding who we actually really are. And of course, we might have heard that in Buddhism we don't have a self. But if that be the case, then that is who we are. So, so it might not necessarily be that we are what we thought we were, but in actually investigating, we begin to discover a greater vista, a greater perspective. But again, it applies that we need guidance. So for us to pursue the path, sort of reinventing the wheel and wanting to do it all on our own premise might be still operating within our realm of projections, and that's where guidance is very helpful. Traleg says guidance here is important so that our search is effective and reduces pain and suffering rather than increasing it. Those three, personal, interpersonal, and superpersonal development, are described among the 20 adverse conflicting emotions and 11 positive emotions, and the process of building positive mental states to elevate our personal experience. So we've talked about the personal dimension of working with our psychology, the interpersonal in terms of relationship with others, and superpersonal. I think Traleg here refers to the relationship to the spiritual guide. So that is where all the teachings then on the um, positive and negative emotions, they enable us to work with our experience. Tension between Buddhist values and cultural values. So, as many of us would might know, then in Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan values are not always Buddhist values. So there's a lot of, you can pick up certain sort of interesting practices that Tibetans do, but they might not necessarily be that important in terms of Buddhism. Yeah? I think it's only too obvious. So, so as practitioners, we emphasize Buddhist values skillfully in our cultural practice, non-aggression, compassion, and so forth. But we need to understand the notions of equality based on the two truths, meditation and post-meditation. Of course, there's an understanding that all things are equal and all things inherently don't possess um, intrinsic truth, but at the same time, that is something that we integrate in the degree to which we integrate that, we see more, we begin to have a greater perspective, but at the same time also, within our post-meditation and so on, we shouldn't let that become some sort of dogma. And we need within post-meditation just to operate within relative conventional truth and operate with the conventional truths that apply there. So, for example, if we have children, then of course we'd want to give our children the best conditions. We can't say, well, my children are no more special than all sentient beings. No, we're going to have to. We have certain children, we have particular ties and conditions. We should operate on a very conventional level and do our best for our children and also for those around us. We can't just say, I'm not going to care about anybody, any of my friends, because all sentient beings are equal. That's not going to work. And it also applies to ourselves. We also shouldn't just say, well, everybody's suffering in samsara, I'm not going to be better than them and not suffer. We obviously should apply ourselves to extract ourselves from suffering. If we're being swept away by a river and we manage to grab onto something, this enables us to also possibly help others. So with an understanding of equality, we still want to elevate ourselves. We are opposing this tendency to diminish ourselves. So this whole this is where this is seen as being part of an interconnected situation where in Buddhist societies, then the monks and the nuns, the monastics, um, they are not in any way sort of above the world, but very much in it and helping the world. Also, the lay people, they also assist the monastics. So there's a mutual exchange. Traleg says, so we clarify the mind through study and practice, and then with humility strive for our own betterment with kindness and diligence and for the benefit of all beings. As I said, there is no contradiction when it comes to developing humility, striving for excellence, and concerning ourselves with the well-being of others. There's no contradiction. Are burn and Tibetan Buddhism the same? Well, by definition, burn and Buddhism are different, but practically they actually are very similar. So burn is the original shamanist culture of Tibet, and it has certain shamanistic aspects which definitely are not Buddhist, animal sacrifice and so on. But the higher teachings of burn, same as the Buddhist teaching, and the Burmpas have some remarkable, great, accomplished masters. So nowadays, the burn and the Buddhists are very much, you know, see eye to eye. They're very much on par. I think even as old as the Dalai Lama in the Tibetan context, is also I think he's the supreme head also of the Bampas. Yeah. Not so obvious to me. So would you kindly give an example of how Tibetan cultural values are not always Buddhist values? Yeah, there's certain practices that that Tibetans would go about that you wouldn't want to adopt. Um, there's Tibetans. They're like something in the Rinpoche would like to say. If it wasn't for Buddhism, some of the Tibetans, especially Eastern Tibetans, they would be worse than some of the worst fundamentalists you have in the world. And so there's a lot of Tibetan values that have a lot to do, a bit like sort of along the lines of Sicilian values. You're supposed to revenge if something happens to somebody in your family. You're supposed to revenge them. If not, you're not a valid human, and so on. There's things like that, and then there's also all the sort of nice little sweet things like you know what white scarves and so on that are not that essential. Then again, they can be nice. Historically, aren't Tibetans quite aggressive and tribal? Well, it depends where in Tibet you're from. Eastern Tibetans, they're a little bit tough. Central Tibetans supposedly are a bit more timid. Anyway, I think we're digressing a bit here. But yes, that's the Tibetan Buddhism is not, it's we need to distinguish between Tibetan cultural values and the Buddhism. Yeah. Okay. Now, to deal with our emotions, we would want a consistent, comprehensive worldview. And this also comes down to this sort of postmodern situation where you don't have truth, and there's so many things that you could know, and yet you can't know everything. So you might end up giving up on the whole thing. But actually, if we study the Dharma, it's possible for us to actually begin to understand a little bit about the world because we're not looking at the object, we're looking at the one who is engaging in the world. And that is actually where the Dharma has an edge in terms of understanding the worldview. And that's where we could actually arrive at a comprehensive worldview. As sentient beings, we get scattered, we get distracted and caught up in the objects, and that's where we become fragmented. So we need to have an understanding. We can have an understanding of reality. It doesn't have to be a dogma. It doesn't have to be I my thing is superior and everybody else should subscribe to it. But it is something that where we see it's something valid. Traleg just says we should have dharmic values, and that there's a footnote there. This sounds like this is more than just I think the editor. Sounds like Traleg himself speaking. He says the term dharmic values here refers to developing clear-mindedness through understanding how the mind works. That is, one develops faith and conviction in some of the central tenets of Buddhism, by the way, not tenets, um, such as dependent arising and insubstantiality or emptiness in order to understand the mind. This also is done to help maintain an other-centered focus and a state of mind intent on acting in a way that builds enrichment and avoids harming oneself and others. Mhm. So, as samsaric beings, being fragmented is what we already are. We think of so many things and value so many things, but in a disorganized way. So we have an internal conflict and we're often torn. But if we have consistency and, for example, dharmic values, our thinking will be more organized. That does not mean one has to be a fundamentalist of some kind or even dogmatic. We do not need to think what I believe is the truth, or only I possess the truth, or what I believe is what everybody should believe. It can be difficult to avoid falling into being either totally dogmatic or totally skeptical. People fall into one or the other pitfall and do not realize that one should be focusing on not falling into either. Life is all about how to negotiate between those two extremes, between extreme skepticism and extreme dogmatism, and the immediate impact that has on our emotional well-being and that of others. The more dogmatic we become, the more emotional we become, and the more skeptical we become, the more emotional we become. So we find that also in terms of our culture, we find these two sort of styles of the skeptic that doesn't believe in anything, but also, that doesn't limit the emotions, and also the fanatic or the dogmatic that also results in extreme emotions. Okay, I think that's takes us to the end of today. Being concerned for the welfare of others, would it somehow mean we should try to be more social and meet new people to engage with them? Well, not necessarily. It's not about behavior. Again, it's about the attitude behind. And then we just let things, evolve as they would um, evolve as things as they would do. So that's all right. Some of the greatest bodhisattvas, they worked on themselves a lot before they begin to engage with others. Because it's not about what we're doing, but it's more about the attitude, the heart behind. Is shyness a positive or negative emotion? That depends really. If if shyness is a way of just staying safe and not really working with ourselves, then it becomes a little bit of a habitual pattern. And that's where it consolidates a place where we don't it consolidates a place of fixation. On the other hand, shyness can also be a very beautiful and very um, positive thing, that we're just modest. So it really is more about what's behind. So any fixation then means we become more emotional. It looks like it, yeah. And then, okay, good. This is a good note to end on. Thank you for sharing the extraordinary. Thank you for sharing the extraordinary Traleg Rinpoche's words and wisdom. Here's to Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche's wisdom, continuing to touch and benefit many. Here, here. Thank you. All right, on that note. So, next time will be the last time. Read the last chapters, enrichment through positive emotions, and how things exist and how things appear. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom.